Sounds good.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen out there in internet land. Welcome to the Reasonably Fine Art Talk. This is our third one. And boy, oh boy, it is so exciting to me. It is so exciting to me because I have put up on my webpage. I've learned so much about this technological stuff. I went and made a YouTube channel. So these are now visible on YouTube. And then I went to my webpage and I created a new page that just links to the YouTubes. So anytime you want to revisit these, just go to www.hunter-studio.com and then go to videos and scroll down and you can click right on the Reasonably Fine Art Talk videos. Now, before we get going with our special guest today, I had promised everyone that I was going to talk a little about the final version of the paper mill painting that I went into the kind of the process last week. This is the way it has ended up. There's a little bit of glare on the left because I'm not a very good photographer, so it's not quite as kind of washed out on the left as it looks. It's more prismatic, a la the passageways in the middle and on the right. But you'll see that area that we talked about last week on the gantry-way, where I had put in that Kills primer to knock out how hard that horizontal passageway was. I've then glazed over that. I've used, in doing this, a whole bunch of Cobra, which is water-mixable paint made by Rembrandt, which is Royal Talens. They are an artist-grade paint. I use them pretty much exclusively for two reasons. One, they are extraordinarily good quality paints. And two, I am a brand ambassador, which means if I say good stuff about them, I get free paint. I also get free hats. Look at this styling hat we got. It's like, it is so cool because it's got the Royal Talens logo, but it's a black hat and the Royal Talens is stitched in black. It doesn't get cooler than that, ladies and gentlemen. And the mastermind behind all this artist outreach and all this, well, the whole ambassador program and teaching people about how Cobra paints can, well, in all of the Rembrandt and Royal Talens product line can be used, is today's guest. We're going to talk a little about Cobra paint, and then he's going to talk more about some other water media, and we're just going to delve right into the weeds. My guest today, ladies and gentlemen, the magnificent Jeff Olson.
Thank you so much for having me, Charlie. It's my pleasure to be here.
It's a delight to have you. Jeff, tell us about water-mixable paint. What the hey? Water mixing with oil? And it isn't water-based paint. It's a true oil paint. How did it come to exist? What is it? Fill us in. We're dying to know.
Well, if we're going to talk about Cobra specifically, yes, it is a true oil paint. I think that's one of the big misnomers out there, that somehow it's more like an acrylic or that it actually has water in the tube. But no, it is in fact a traditional oil paint. The only difference is they've added an emulsifier, which allows the paint to be mixed with water. Emulsifiers are these magic little molecules that have a water-loving end and an oil-loving end. And that's what holds the oil and the water together. They're really super common in food products. Salad dressings, for example, have the emulsifier. Matter of fact, the emulsifier we use is also a vegetable oil. It comes from soy, and it's the same one that's used in products like salad dressing. Mayonnaise, for example, is a natural emulsifier in it. So it's something that's been around for years. And in oil painting specifically, emulsifiers have been used since the very beginning. Traditional egg tempera, if you've ever worked with that, the egg yolk is what you put your pigments in, and egg yolk also has those natural emulsifiers in it. And oil painters used to still combine egg yolk with their oil paints for many, many years. Rembrandt used to do it to create those wonderful textures. So emulsifiers are nothing new in the process, but they give us that magic quality of being able to mix the paint with water.
And who said, gosh, we need to come up with a water mixable oil? How did that whole thing come about?
Yeah, well, it goes back about, geez, almost 50 years now. I was going to say, I'm showing my age. It was in the 70s, right, that it really started to be explored. And the main focus in the beginning was the toxicity of solvents that are used in traditional oil painting. So white spirits, for example, or turpentine especially, give off fumes that can be very bad for your health. And in the 70s, there was a big movement that began as part of the ecology movement, the environmental movement, to find materials that we could use that would not put people in jeopardy or would not be harmful to the environment. So there was a move towards that. In the beginning, there wasn't really a lot of professional materials available for artists in these first generations of water mixable oils. So they didn't have all the pigment that we have today, nor had they fine-tuned the emulsification process to the point or to the extent that we have today. But the motivation was health and environment. And painting without solvents was the main goal. My career in the art materials industry goes back some 25 years, and some of the folks who were buying it in the beginning, it was almost exclusively that way. But today, there are a lot of classrooms, for example, where those products are not allowed or permitted. Workshop rooms where it's not permitted. It's certainly inconvenient if you're traveling, you're a plein air painter, to always be slogging along white spirits with you, and then you got to dispose of it and so on. So the idea or the aspect of being able to paint without spirits was a big positive for a lot of folks.
Right. Oh, that was the initial reason I started using them. Was that using? Well, I used to sit over a drawing table and work on paintings like this far from me. And with turpentine, I didn't know anything at the time. I didn't have any venting going on. And after a couple of hours, you just feel nauseous, You do. And so I started out using the ones that were immediately available, which tended to be Windsor Newton's Artisan brand. And I was quite happy using Artisan because at that time, when I started using them was when I was starting to paint with Richard Schmidt and the Putney Painters. And Richard's kind of go-to color combination for just getting a block in place is, it's transparent oxide red, which Windsor Newton doesn't make, but burnt sienna worked close enough. And Viridian, which Windsor Newton makes and Cobra doesn't, as it turns out. But that red-green mixed together, and you do your initial pass with that and then carve your shapes out, and a little ultramarine blue, that's basically the three sisters of the painting process that I use. Yeah. And I was at a plein air event I was painting with my friend Barbara Berry at Wayne Plein Air in 2016, I think. And I opened a new tube of Windsor Newton Artisan Viridian, and it did not emulsify with water. The quality control of Windsor of Artisan basically went to hell in 2016, and I think it was that year that I met Kyle, because he came up. Kyle Richardson, ladies and gentlemen, runs Royal Talens North America. Kyle came up to a Putney Painters session and was like, "Oh, you should use our Cobra line." And the Cobra paints are much more buttery than the Artisan. The Artisan is very stiff paint, and I also believe the Artisan is more of a student grade, and the Cobra is more of a artist grade. Is that correct?
Well, you know, I can't comment specifically on the Windsor product in terms of its quality range. We did model 2 Cobra paints. I've got actually some tubes here. We've got an artist and a study. And our study is certainly, I'm backwards. Our study paint is probably more akin to what Winsor Newton has in their product. And then we have, of course, the Cobra artist, which was modeled or designed based on the Rembrandt formula. So Rembrandt is our marquee. Extra fine is what we use as terminology. So it's the professional level. So this Cobra artist is as high a quality product as our Rembrandt paints. And the formulation of it, you mentioned how smooth and creamy and buttery it is. That's because it's using the same formula as the Rembrandt in terms of its creation and the working properties that we were, you know, shooting for with the paint. And then, of course, there's the study, which is more going to be like the Artisan that folks are used to. A very good paint to use, just not quite as much pigment in it. And I certainly could talk about the difference between professional and study if you want me to.
Yeah, that's probably. I have 2 follow-up questions on the artist grade paints. First off, if someone bought Cobras and experimented with them and then decided they didn't like them and wanted to go back to conventional oil, you could use that Cobra paint as conventional oil, could you not?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a true oil paint.
Right. So it, as far as it knows, it is Rembrandt oil paint. It just doesn't know that it can also work with water.
Exactly. You can use Cobra in combination with any other oil paint that's out there. It is a true oil paint. The binder, like I said before, is linseed oil. That's the dominant ingredient. The next one are the pigments, of course, and you'll get more or less pigment depending on the properties of that individual pigment. But you can use Cobra with anything. The amount of emulsifier in there is really only consequential in terms of its ability to mix with water. Beyond that, you're working with a true oil paint in every aspect of it. And even, and this is something folks don't know, if you maintain a 2-to-1 ratio, so 2 parts Cobra and 1 part the other traditional oil, it'll retain its water miscibility. So that's a fact that a lot of folks don't know.
Oh, really? So I could use Rembrandt Viridian. You guys start making a Viridian. I could use Rembrandt Viridian and it would retain being water mixable paint.
As long as you maintain that 2-to-1, you could use one of our.
Okay, right. So I can't use 1-to-1.
Right. So if you could use a medium, for example, you could use the glazing medium or the quick dry medium, which you're familiar with both of those, and add a little bit of the Rembrandt Viridian to that medium, and it would work as a water mixable or miscible product.
The other thing I want to follow up with about the artist grade paint, I don't know if it's true of the student grade paint because I've not used the student grade, but the artist grade, very often, not always, but sometimes you open a new tube and there's a whole lot of oil that comes out. It weeps. And a couple of students of mine have, asked me if that is a problem or not. I've never had it be a problem.
No, yeah.
Concerning when it happens.
It's very common, especially in higher end oil paints, not just Rembrandt or Cobra artists, for example. And why that happens is the amount of pigment that's in it. So every different color, every different pigment, it's kind of a balancing act. Some pigments, there's a lot of pigment with a little oil. Some paints, it's the other way around. And often when they're in the tube, what will happen is there's a little bit of separation because there's so much pigment. And that
oil. Are you dying there? Are you all right?
Right.
Okay, is that water or oil that you're drinking?
A little bit of oil. I got to run down there. So at any rate, what's happening is the pigment saturation level is pushing out some of that oil. So what I always recommend to people is you just squeeze that first little bit out on a piece of cardboard or a paper towel. Let that soak out. If you want, the paint to be less oily too. This is a little trick we used to use to get a real heavy bodied oil paint, is if you squeeze out some of your paint the night before on a piece of cardboard and come back the next day, it actually pulls a lot of the oil out of it and makes the paint a little pastier. But just in the short term, that's a quick way to get rid of that extra oil that comes out of the top. But yeah, it's a very common occurrence with higher end oil paints.
Huh. Interesting. Interesting. So it's like it's a sign of good quality as opposed
yeah,
to
lots of pigment out in there, and it's forcing the oil back out. Yeah.
Huh. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you a little about, so I can learn about it, is the mediums, the Cobra mediums. What is the difference between the taking painting medium as the medium, quick dry medium, and then glazing medium? Why would one use a glazing medium as opposed to the painting medium? What glazing with the painting medium?
Right. No, that's a great question, and there is some confusion, especially between the painting medium and the glazing medium. You know, the quick dry medium, obviously, it's got some ingredients that help the paint to dry faster. But the main difference between the painting medium and the glazing medium, the painting medium includes water in its composition. So you have vegetable oils, you have some synthetic resins, that's in both of them, and the painting medium has that water. And the reason for that is it makes it less fat. So the painting medium is not as fat as the glazing medium. That makes it more successful in using throughout the painting process, not just in those glazing layers. So it increases the gloss and transparency, just like the glazing medium does. It makes the brush stroke run a little bit smoother, a little more fluid. There's no influence on the drying time for either of these. They both increase the durability of the paint film. They both can be thinned with water, but the addition of water in the painting medium makes it less fat, so it's safer to use in terms of the integrity of the paint film throughout the painting process. The glazing medium is really meant for those final layers of color that you're putting on, where you need the paint to be fatter, because when you mix glazing medium with the paint, it makes it fatter.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who do not know about fat over lean, it is basically that you want your initial layers to have very, very little of the fat. You want to use, so it's out of the tube, or just using water and out of the tube paint. And then once that dries, you can get fatter and fatter, and the fat allows for translucency. So the light passes through the fat layer, hits the substrate, and bounces back, and you get beautiful luminous passages. Is that fair to say, Jeff?
Absolutely, and it's related to how oil paint dries. So oil paint dries through a process of oxidation. All the binders for different oil paints, whether it's linseed oil or safflower oil or poppy seed oil or walnut oil, whichever it is, they're considered the drying oils. And the way they dry is they absorb oxygen. They don't evaporate. So it's a very slow chemical process. The more oil there is in the mixture, the longer it takes to dry. So those so-called lean layers that we put on the bottom, that's usually a solvent. If you're traditional painter using some spirits, with Cobra, it's a little water. So the paint is very lean. It has less fat content. Then when you start adding more oils into it, which is what's happening when you're adding mediums, that makes the paint fatter. It's just like cooking. Kind of think of it like butter. You know, you're adding more butter to the product as you build it up, which means those final layers take longer to dry. You don't want to put those fat layers underneath because they won't dry as quickly, and that'll cause cracking and shrinking, and sometimes the paint just falls right off the canvas. So you want to make sure if you're doing layers that you're following that process. Alla prima, that's a different story. That's alla prima is a term where you're putting the paint on all at one sitting, kind of like a plein air exercise. There you're mixing wet into wet. There you don't have to be concerned with the fat over lean process.
Good to know, because I never have been on. So why don't you? Let me just turn it over to you right now. I know you've got a slideshow to go over. So let me I'll disappear from the screen, but I may yell out a question now and again.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to share my screen here. So that's the idea here, share screen. So can you see that presentation there, Charlie?
Not yet. I can see your beautiful face.
All right, let me see. Share your screen. Wants to share your screen. Choose what you'd like to share. I want to share that. Okay. How about now?
Not yet. Jeff is technologically snake today.
Killing me today.
Well, I can just keep talking with you. We can chat. You know, you can keep trying, and then when it shows up.
About Cobra, while I figure out why my screen won't share here.
Ladies and gentlemen, meet Charbonneau. Charbonneau's stopped by to say hi. This is Charbo. Here we go. Charbonneau is like the world's nicest cat, ladies and gentlemen, but he's not. He does not want to be on television. He's like, nope, to hell with this. Just stopping by to see if there's any good food. Well, while you're working on that, Jeff.
Oh, that's okay.
Let me ask you about. I've over the years, the medium I tend to use when I want a little bit more oil in there, especially when I'm working plein air. Where the problem with the water as the medium is once you've got the paint down, it's not dried, but you do another pass over the paint with watery paint. It kind of bites into the paint that's already there. It doesn't slide over it. So you want a little bit of fat to make a layer that you can brush over the leaner layer. To me, the Cobra mediums are a little too thick. I want something that's just a little bit oily. So I use the Windsor Newton Artisan safflower oil, which is a pale, it's paler than linseed oil. Apparently the paint film bond is not as strong as linseed. That's the downside to safflower oil, I hear tell. Why does Cobra not make either linseed oil or safflower oil water mixable product? Lucas Berlin, which makes awful paint otherwise, makes a perfectly good. I don't expect you to say anything bad about other brands of paint. I know you can't. Your ethics and professional courtesy would prevent that, but I can say bad things about them. But why is there not just a pure oil offered by Cobra?
I think part of this is going to be speculative because I'm not in the minds of the folks who are in product development. I do know that all of our feedback, and that's part of the ambassador program, all of our feedback is taken into consideration. And I think when Cobra was first launched, it was more about keep it simple. That's why there are only 3 mediums, right? We've got 4 mediums if you include the paste. So those are what are available now. There are plans to expand the line. For example, we want to expand to have the same color assortment that we have with Rembrandt, which is 120 colors. So that, over the next couple of years, that's almost going to double the size of colors available. And certainly we're looking at all the drying oils as possible additions to the water-mixable line or the solvent-free painting program. So you probably will see those come up in the next couple of years. So it wasn't so much unwillingness as much of it was, hey, we're going to get started with these products. Let's make sure we have the things we know people are going to need right out of the chute. And then as we go forward, we'll rely on our ambassadors and our customers and our loyal product users to talk to us about what should be the next additions to the line.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the painting paste. This is a thing that seems to baffle people. I was using it a lot last year. I'd like you to talk about it a little bit, but I gotta say, I used it on a painting last year, and then I picked up the painting recently, It had been in store in a flat file, and it had gone very, very yellow. And I said that to Kyle, and Kyle was like, "Oh, if it's not exposed to sunlight, if it's in the dark, it'll yellow."
That's a true, and that's not just our products. That's all products that have the linseed oil in them. So if they're deprived of light, they will darken. So a lot of folks see that. If you've ever been into museum archives with curators and they pull those things out of the vaults, they're very dark, and it takes a while after being exposed to light for the color to come back out.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating what happens, and it's part of the oxidation process, just being deprived of light. These drying oils have that feature. It is true that all linseed oil based products will yellow over time slightly. And you'll see that more in lighter colors and whites. And when we go to the museum and we look at a painting by Rembrandt or Van Eyck, very often those white areas have a yellow tint to them. So that is part of linseed oil. But what you're talking about, where something's in the dark, where there's no light to it, it actually darkens, but it will lighten up after being exposed to UV light again.
Okay, so now tell us about the painting paste. What the thought behind that is, what its utility is.
Right. So a lot of people like to refer to it as simply oil paint without the pigment. And for all intents and purposes, that's what it is. It's kind of a whipped up version of the painting medium, if you will. And the reason for it, in addition to the line, is a lot of folks want to have some of the benefits of the painting medium, like extending the paint, creating more transparency, making the paint film more durable, but they want to retain the brush stroke. They want that texture that the brush makes with the paint on its own, where you lose that a little bit when you use a painting medium or a glazing medium. So the painting paste enables you to get all those great qualities from the painting medium or the glazing medium, but still have that wonderful texture of the paint itself. So that's the advantage of using the painting medium.
Okay. Now, before we close, I'd like to hear a little about how you feel. Oh, hey, it's his desktop.
Can you see it?
Hey, yes, we can see it now.
Let's do this.
Let's do it. We can go long. If people get bored, just for something else. So go for it, Jeff.
Yeah, we're going to switch gears from Cobra for a minute. Charlie and I were talking, and gouache has been coming up over and over again in a lot of our conversations, a lot of conversations with the ambassadors. A lot of artists out there are rediscovering this medium that's been around for a long time. And we thought it'd be great to share with you folks just a little bit about it.
Can I jump in a sec, Jeff?
Sure.
The reason I wanted to talk about this in the Reasonably Fine Art Talk, ladies and gentlemen, and Jeff, well, not that Jeff isn't a gentleman, but the reason I wanted to talk about it, folks, is when we did the Entraîneur trip last year, which was riding the train from basically Chicago to Santa Fe, stopping in 5 towns along the way to paint. One of the painters, Larry Moore, had gouache with him, and his setup and tear down was 1/10 what it took us oil painters to do. And it just seems to me, and especially in these meetings with the ambassadors, there is a great deal of interest in gouache from oil painters. And I think folks are really curious about it. What's the difference between it and watercolor? What's its history? So Jeff is going to fill us in about it. Go, take it away, Jeff.
I will, absolutely. Thank you for that segue, because it's really becoming popular. People are interested in it, and it's a great transition medium for oil painters, and certainly a lot easier, like you were saying, to work with. And it's got a great history. The image that I have up on the screen right now is from Persia, modern day Iran. This is from the 9th century. Painting with opaque watercolors goes back a long time. Not as far back as watercolor painting does. But the use of gouache, or an opaque watercolor as it's often referred to, has this very, very rich history, mainly because you can get these beautiful detailed images. And this is one of those Persian miniatures. A lot of folks have seen these. They're beautiful, detailed works of everyday life, of their religious ceremonies and figures, and just a wonderful tradition. And these are all done with a product that is virtually the same thing as the gouache we use today. Gouache itself, the term, comes from the Italian word guazzo, which was a term applied to the 16th century practice of applying oil paint over tempera. So for those of you who remember your art history, in the Gothic period, the late Gothic, most painters were using tempera paint, which is the egg yolk binder. And then when oil paint came on the scene for European painters, especially in the north, they didn't just go directly to painting with oil or abandon the tempera altogether. They would paint a base of tempera and then go over the top of it and do some glazes with oil paint. And here we have the Lamentation of Christ by Mantegna in 1480, and this is an example of that technique. So that's where the term gouache comes from, guazzo. Gouache came into play and was referred to as gouache in the 18th century in France, and it was most commonly used in combination with pastel. A lot of folks don't know that about pastel, but pastel is a wonderful mixed media material as well as gouache, and they would lay out their paints, they would get their gradations with the gouache and then finish the painting with the pastel. And here we have de la Tour, and this is an image from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If you've ever seen these portraits from the 18th century by these French artists, they are fantastic, these pastel portraits. Chardin is another artist who used the same technique with gouache. And then we get to the 19th century, Impressionists and Post-Impressionists popularized gouache again as part of their embrace of plein air painting. So the same reasons you were mentioning, Charlie. We had people like Monet and Van Gogh here painting with gouache as a way to do quick studies and finish paintings when they were out painting on plein air. Then we get to the 20th century. This is a beautiful image by Jacob Lawrence, The Lovers from 1946. Modernist painters at one time or another experimented with gouache. Mark Rothko is a famous abstract expressionist, used gouache in his paintings until he discovered his unique style. Helen Frankenthaler, who's really famous for her soak stain technique with oils and acrylics, started with gouache. So it was a very popular tool even with modernist painters. And of course we have Jacob Lawrence here, who was one of the stars of the Harlem Renaissance and did these wonderful gouache images. And part of it came from his introduction to commercial art. Gouache was very popular with illustrators up until the time when photography started to take over. And then currently, this is an artist, Joanne Freeman. She's an abstract painter, and they really like to incorporate the gouache as part of their message. So these abstract painters enjoy it for its vibrant color, but also its utilitarian simplicity. The material is very direct, vibrant color, and they're letting the medium speak for what it is and the strengths of the medium itself. So those are, some of the historical qualities and contemporary artists who are using the paint. You had mentioned, comparing it to watercolor. What are some of the properties and colors? And I'll talk about that real quickly. And feel free to jump in with any questions as I go through here. So gouache is somewhat absorbent, not as absorbent as watercolor. It doesn't soak into the paper quite as much. And it also creates a paint film, which watercolor does not. So it self-levels and creates this very smooth, clean area of color that gouache is known for. It's excellent for color mixing, especially subtractive color mixing. It's used a lot in academic classes where they're studying color theory. It's also permeable, just like watercolor. So once it dries, you're still able to reactivate it with water and change it and add to it. So it shares that with watercolor. It's opaque, unlike watercolor, so you can paint in layers and you can use it on a toned surface to create some really dramatic effects. It dries very quickly, not as quick as a watercolor, but almost, and it has a very uniform matte finish. So the color that you get off of it is very uniform across the surface. You don't have any hot spots or shiny spots ever. You get this really wonderful matte brown. I highlighted this area because this is something I really wanted to share. It's an excellent medium for mixed media. And this example behind here, this is Mary Cassatt. It's a self-portrait. She's using watercolor, graphite in this, as well as gouache. So some of the transparent areas you can see are watercolor, and then she goes back into the features of the face in the silk portrait and uses gouache, and you can also see some of the lines of the graphite. So gouache is a very, very good tool to introduce as mixed media. Gouache does not bleed like watercolor. It doesn't bloom like that. It gives you very clean, crisp edges. It's super easy to clean up, you know, solvents, just water, just like with a watercolor process. So like you were saying, very easy, very portable. This is one of the challenges with gouache that takes a little bit of time when you first get started out. There is some color shift. That means the colors change as it dry. The lighter colors tend to get a little darker. The dark colors tend to get a little lighter. This is something I struggled with in the beginning. You'd get all the colors the way you liked them when it was wet, and then it would all kind of dry to the middle, and you get this kind of gray-looking tonal painting.
Yes.
And so that's something you have to adjust to. So you really exaggerate. You know, you make your lights a little bit lighter than you think that you want them. The dark's a little bit darker, and it all comes together in the end. And then one warning here at the end: it has very poor elasticity. It can crack or peel, especially if you apply it thickly. My recommendation is always paint on a surface that is very firm, like a panel or paper that's mounted, or a block. You can't roll up a wash paint.
Like my new watercolor block from Rembrandt?
Exactly. Color like the Rembrandt are perfect. And then finally here, I wanted to do a little comparison to some other types of water media. So I've got ink, watercolor, gouache, and acrylic. I have some of the different binders here: shellac, gum arabic, dextrin for gouache. Dextrin is a potato starch. A lot of folks didn't know that. It's super inexpensive, wonderful working qualities, and they're what give gouache its unique kind of working properties. A lot of folks ask, well, why is gouache more opaque than watercolor? They both use pigment as a coloring agent. The difference is two things about the pigment itself. For one thing, there's more pigment in gouache than there is in watercolor. The binder holds more pigment, so that helps contribute to its opacity. And the pigment size is larger, so it doesn't get ground down as finely as a watercolor pigment. So that combination of the larger pigments and the density of pigments is what makes gouache opaque. There are some colors that we add opacifiers to, naturally transparent pigments, but pigment size and density are what contribute to gouache's opacity. Light fast is good to excellent. In our range, the Talens range, those are all the colors are very archival. We talked about the opacity. I talked about the adhesion being fair compared to others. Watercolors, has a little bit better. Ink has really good, and of course acrylic, that sticks to almost anything. Dry time is very rapid with the gouache. It is permeable, so you can reactivate it. And then of course the elasticity we talked about. You can't roll it up like you can with an acrylic painting. And that is the finish, and I'm back. Can you see me again?
Yes, we can see you. No, that was great. Thank you, Jeff.
That's my very short gouache story, but hopefully it answers some questions that folks have out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's terrific. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys are now offering both tube gouache and dry pan gouache, correct?
In the Talens brand, we just have the tube and jars, and then we have another brand that's just coming out that will be available in the pans. And so keep an eye out for that. It's a new product that we've taken on, and you'll be able to see that. There it is.
There it is. And I got to remember to always take this off. This is the flesh colors, which I love. This is flesh. But then there's a regular spectrum, because Kyle gave me a set of the regular spectrum, and the tube gouache I am intimidated by, but I promise, and those of you watching, I'm going to experiment with gouache in the next week, and we'll put up at the next Reasonably Fine Art Talk. We'll see where the gouache goes. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeff.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I really think it's been great. Folks watching this, please comment in Facebook. I will read the comments and respond. Jeff, good luck with your computer issues. Thank you for taking the time.
No problem.
Joy. So
Thank you. And for folks who want to find out more about these products, join us at the Creator Studio Live every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern on Facebook and every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern on Instagram, where we talk to artists like Charlie and talk about all the wonderful materials like Cobra. So join us for that.
Terrific. All right. Take good care, everybody. And thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlie.
Bye.